Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing. And we will jump right in here. And we are on chapter 81, which is the final chapter of the Daodejing. And it begins, honest words are not beautiful. So this is going to bring up a couple of different concepts from what we've been looking at previously in the Tao Te Ching. What are your initial thoughts on what might be meant by this?
To me, it's saying like it's not easy to be honest.
So the struggle is what makes the honest words not beautiful. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Like if you're being honest with somebody, it's really hard sometimes,
Hmm.
especially if it's somebody that you love.
Or maybe that honest words are counterintuitive.
Mm. So in that sense, it would be like maybe they're not fun to hear.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got the idea that they're maybe not the easiest to say, maybe not the easiest to hear. But beautiful is an interesting term to use in this context. What do you think's being communicated with the concept of beautiful and words?
It could just be that it's making a distinction between honesty and beauty and saying that they are not the same thing. So, kind of like saying you can optimize words for honesty or you can optimize them for beauty, but in either case you're optimizing them for different things.
Mm. And I know it's going back quite a ways to chapter 2, but does anybody recall some thoughts on what the Tao Te Ching had to say about the concept of beauty? Did you just pull it up, Dane?
Well, it says there we can only see beauty because there's such a thing as ugliness.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways that that's translated. One is that kind of the idea that we need the contrast, that there has to be ugliness to be able to see beauty, which is along the lines of the way it's translated in the one that you have. The other is that once you declare that something's beauty or beautiful, you've declared other things to be ugly. So there's a couple of different angles on that one. But that chapter continues to talk about other types of differences. So there's the beauty ugly contrast, and then there's the good evil contrast. And then it switches gears to things that are more natural, like long and short, front and back, and how there's different types of opposites. And the contrast that's being made is that there's in the natural realm of things, let's say something's long or short or, front and back, that these are not in conflict with each other. They're more kind of like on a spectrum of natural ways that things are that complement each other. But with the differences of beauty and ugly and good and evil, what's happened is we've brought in value judgments, and these don't actually complement each other, but they work against each other. They're at war with one another. And so this is the beginnings of the challenge in the Tao Te Ching to our value assessments of things and how they can be, in a sense, destructive because they're not cooperative, in a sense, with the rest of what they're being compared to, but they create a conflict. They create a challenge between the two. So one of the things that can be brought into play here is if we're trying to bring in the concept of beauty to how we are speaking, that this
Uh,
may have to
Red
do.
tea, hot latte, non-fat. Nope.
I'm going to mute Rob here. Um, so if we are applying this idea of beauty to words, part of what might be going on is that we have a a value judgment that's coming into play for how we're trying to communicate that is moving more into that social realm that's being examined from the Taoist perspective. If from a cultural perspective, we might have somebody who's a very eloquent speaker or saying things that sound very beautiful, but they might not be very truthful. And so the concern here is that what's really valuable is this idea of honesty or truth versus this idea of eloquence. And that sometimes there's a distinction that's happening here that when somebody is working to communicate on that level, that it is complicating, in a sense, the truth. So, in a real way, we could be getting back to this concept of simplicity that is sometimes talked about in terms of the uncarved wood or whatnot, that there's a natural way that things are, but that our cultural constructs are trying to get things to conform, which would equate to the idea of the carved wood. And so the beautiful words might be words that are being shaped, carved, if you will, to fit within that cultural construct of what's accepted as beautiful versus ugly, as opposed to being more simple or honest or direct about how they're trying to communicate. I think this also probably ties in a bit with the idea of the suspicion about language in the first place, that language is always going to be um, suspect in the way that we're able to communicate with it, especially if we're trying to move into this realm of eloquence. Follow how that those concepts tie together in what the Tao Te Ching's been bringing up in terms of this idea of beauty and issues of social ways of conforming actions, and in this case, language, versus what they're suggesting here is just kind of the straight, simple, honest, truthful speech. So then the converse comes into play. Beautiful words are not honest. Now, again, this is sometimes using a bit of a hyperbole. So it's not to say that, somebody couldn't say something very profound that also happens to be beautiful. But I think the idea here is that when the goal or the aim is this idea of beautiful or eloquence, that it can potentially corrupt the honest communication. That's not to say that we might not find something that's very honest to be very beautiful. So it's just getting into how are we valuing different things and how are we looking at things from our perspective as well. It's going to continue then. There'll be 3 of these kind of sections. The next one says, one who is adept. And this concept of adept is frequently translated as good, but it's more in the sense of good at, which is why this translation uses adept, which I think is a better way to look at it, especially after we just talked about the contrast, like between good, evil, that this would be more of a value judgment. So this is looking at more of the idea of skill, someone who's skilled or who is adept or good at. It says, does not argue. And argue here is interesting in looking at it and the different ways that this also gets translated. It seems as though it gets to the idea of trying to get into the weeds or to focus on the particulars or the details. And so another way that this has been translated and the kind of the concept it comes up with is making distinctions between things, is what they're getting at with this idea of argue. So in terms of adept, it doesn't talk about or identify here specifically what is someone good at or what are they skilled at, but it's simply saying one who is skilled. So there's kind of 2 questions we have then. One is, what do you think the adeptness applies to? And then how do you see that applying to the idea of arguing or distinguishing?
I would assume because it seems like they're talking about language or speaking. So, I mean, one who is adept at speaking
Mm.
doesn't argue. That's what I'm getting.
Anybody else have some thoughts?
Somebody who's an expert doesn't argue with amateurs
Mm.
in whatever domain.
And so, as somebody who actually enjoys debating, this can sound a little bit like, oh shoot, they're attacking something I enjoy. Um, but I think there's different ways that this idea of argue can be explored, and also putting it, as Taylor said, in the context of language and the skill in communicating and not needing to argue or needing to get into making distinctions becomes kind of interesting.
Well, debate and argue seem like quite different. They have quite different meanings. Um, and what comes to mind for me is sometimes I'll see comments maybe on YouTube or on Facebook that are talking about something, a scientific topic, but are just kind of like really argumentative in tone. They're like, "Oh, Einstein was an idiot. He said this and this, but they're contradictory, and everybody's too stupid to realize it." And I realized, okay, well, this person obviously isn't like an expert in the field because that's not how experts in the field talk
Mm,
about mathematical or scientific ideas. They don't like talk about it like they're arguing. They talk about it in like a professional way, and they like the tone the tone is completely different. So even though a person might be using some big words, uh, and might like know some seem to know some advanced concepts in science or math or whatever, um, they're clearly like wrapped up in some sort of ego battle or something, or for them it's like it's uh they're really not like experts or professionals in that field. Just you it's easy to tell just by the like the tone and the way they make points, because scientists certainly do debate with each other, and they have alternate views, and they discuss them, but it's if you actually went into uh, like a chat room or something, maybe a Reddit page where there are actual scientists discussing science, it has a whole different tone to it. It just sounds different. It doesn't sound like arguing.
mm.
It sounds more like intellectual debate, which is, in my mind, different than arguing. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
like putting people down and making people feel small and saying things are stupid. It's like making coherent points and using logic and stuff like that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it definitely is this idea of being skilled coming into play, and definitely the context thus far has been in the realm of language. So the honest words versus beautiful words. And here we're talking about arguing a point maybe versus having another way of going about it. Or I think there's a key point in the aspect of that concept of argue in terms of distinguishing that I think comes into play. Because one of the other things that we've seen is a concern within the Taoist concept of seeing how things are interconnected or interrelated, or um, in a more technical sense, how we've talked about this codependent origination, uh, that there's a connection that's difficult to separate. So I think the skill definitely has to do with the communication, but also maybe in terms of how they're looking at things, that changes the dynamics in terms of whether or not they're trying to argue or trying to make these distinctions, which is interesting. It's kind of got a wide range of areas that it impacts, which again is kind of the fun part of the minimalist nature of the text. But it definitely brings out, I think, all of the aspects that you guys have brought up uh, in thinking about this. And of course, it's going to have then the contrary. One who argues is not adept, or one who is practicing distinguishing is not adept. And the third one says, one who knows is not expansive. And this one's a little bit trickier, but it seems as though, like, sometimes they'll have the first one translated like one who is wise is not learned, which is kind of making maybe a contrast between different ways of knowing about the world. One who's wise maybe is wise from the sense of their experience versus one who has learned, which would be somebody who kind of went through the school system and they've been taught what all the things are that they're supposed to learn. This is, and that's a little bit more of an interpretive leap. Um, the question is, what do we mean by expansive? Does this mean that they've learned a lot of different things, and this is why they're equating it to like an education versus the idea of wisdom? But they're not exactly using those terms here. So there's definitely the idea of knowing something that is in contrast to this idea of expansive. Um, what do you think they're trying to get at here? The
Well, I
expand.
assume they're going to flip it and
Expansive in the sense
say,
of boastful.
Well, we had two of you. Taylor, why don't you go
yeah,
first?
sorry, go ahead, Dane.
Well, could mean expansive in the sense of like boastful.
Mm.
Expansive like the chest. Or expansive in the way that somebody who wants to pretend or give off the impression of being more knowledgeable than they are will sort of like inflate their language with flowery words and be really circuitous and say a bunch of stuff that doesn't mean anything to make it sound like they know more than they do.
Yeah, like saying a lot, but saying nothing at the same time.
Yeah. And there's also the concept of expansive in terms of broad. So maybe along the lines of what you're saying, Dane, is that they're coming across as though they know a lot of different things or a broad variety of things in terms of how they're trying to talk. And so the idea of know, if you're taking that contrast, would you understand know then in the sense of um, thinking about the or being aware of the limits of what we know? Is that how you see that contrast?
You mean in the sense of staying in one's lane, in the sense that if somebody's an expert, at least certainly in the modern context, being an expert on a topic means that you have kind of a narrow uh, expertise of a specific topic, but it doesn't mean that you know everything about everything. So there's a common thing actually with influencers on YouTube who will be like often they might be academics or professors or scientists and like experts in a particular field, and then they get kind of popular for talking about that specific subject that their expertise is in, and people are like, hey, this guy or gal is really smart, and it kind of goes to their head, and then they start talking about all kinds of subjects, different areas of science or politics or things that they're not actually experts in, but still like talking as if they're an expert.
Hmm. Yeah, it's
Somebody
interesting.
so, like actually an expert in the field will talk about that field that they're actually knowledgeable in, but not try to pretend to be an expert in everything else.
Yeah, I like that distinction then between awareness of the limits of your knowledge versus thinking that you have that more broader perspective or knowledge of more than what you do have knowledge of. And that would fit well with some of the different concepts that we've seen throughout the Tao Te Ching in terms of that aspect that we can never know everything about anything. That there's a fallibilism, a epistemological humility is a fancy word for recognizing that we don't know everything. Um, yeah, I like that. So I'll just add in a thought. And again, this is not saying that this is what it is, but just some things that had occurred to me. So in the prior one, we were looking at the idea of distinguishing, which is maybe in contrast to the idea of more of a unified way of looking at things. So when you distinguish a bunch of different things as opposed to seeing it more as a single thing, then the expansive might have to do with seeing our world made up of a bunch of stuff, a bunch of different things that need to be known and understood versus more of a unified central concept. It's hard to say, but the expansiveness got me thinking a bit about that. But I do like what Dane has brought up here in terms of um, expansive in terms of the scope of our knowledge versus, recognizing the limits of our knowledge is another really good way of looking at that. But I think they still kind of play off the same general concept in terms of, how are we looking at the world? If we're looking at the world from the perspective of recognizing that we don't know everything, that's also similar in concept to looking at the world in a way that it's made up of a bunch of different things versus one thing. And I say that very generically. It's more like more unified, I should say, as opposed to distinct. But both of those kind of concepts, I think, work well with what this passage is getting into. And of course, the flip around is going to happen. One who is expansive does not know. The only thing that I wonder about here too is if we're talking about expansive in terms of thinking of our range of knowledge, it would be kind of an interesting, like it would almost be critical of like a generalist who has maybe a little bit of knowledge of a wide variety of things versus someone who's a specialist. So I don't know that there's like that specialist generalist thing going on, but I do like how Dane is making that contrast between the limits of what we know versus thinking that we know more than we do, or kind of stepping outside the lane, like he says. So we have this opening with three different contrasts, right? Between honest and beautiful words, between being skilled and arguing or distinguishing, and then now between knowing and expansive. So it's going to switch gears a little bit, and it doesn't have a therefore, but it's going to switch to, well, what does the sage do? The sage avoids accumulation. So this is interesting. Um, you've had a chance to wrestle with some different aspects throughout the Daodejing up to this point. What what are the categories that they tend to look at the idea of accumulation within? How is that normally discussed or explored within the Tao Te Ching?
One who is knowledgeable adds a little each day, or one who's clever adds a little each day, or to become clever, add a little each day, to become wise, subtract a little each day.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the passages that would have to do with something like this. And that's interesting in that passage because that would tie into, again, the idea of knowledge or uh, potentially how we're speaking as well.
Well, it likes to nod to the uncarved wood. I think piece of carved wood accumulates carvings, and uncarved wood does not accumulate carvings.
Interesting. If we take it into more of the political and economic realm, what are some of the concepts that we've seen pop up?
Well, certainly hoarding wealth or possessions.
Mhm. Do you recall any of the
Um,
concepts that it addresses in that regard, Dane?
Fill your house with jade and gold and expect it to be robbed.
Mm. hmm Can't protect it. Yeah. Taylor, were you going to say something?
well, I'm just thinking about when it talks about the people and kind of their views of the leaders, but I'm having a hard time connecting it to accumulation, I think.
Mm. So
Well, the
I'm sorry,
power,
say that again, Dane.
accumulation of power.
Mm. Yeah, there could be that too, right? From that political
It's
perspective.
better to not have not rule a nation like a small fish, like you would cook a small fish.
Mm. The non-interference. Yeah. Yeah, and so they've talked a lot about um, desires, how culture can shape desires for precious things or rare things, and that it can bring about like this running around chasing after stuff and trying to collect things. It's made distinctions between the aristocracy might be doing really well while the rest of the people are starving because the inept way of governing the country has left the granaries empty. So it's definitely challenged the idea of this hoarding. When it got into the three treasures of the Tao Te Ching, one of them was this idea of frugality, or maybe more of this idea of generousness. So it's definitely looked at the social implications of what it means to how we think about the distribution of things, right? So if we start from where this chapter is opening up, that there's more of this simple approach to things, there's this skilled approach to things, there's this knowledgeable approach to things, that one of the ways that this might manifest itself or be seen is in recognizing how we deal with material things in our world and how that relates to the rest of the community, but also the environment. There's always the looking to nature within the Tao Te Ching for how humans should behave. And we certainly don't see kind of a hoarding concept happening generally in nature. Um, there's more of an approach of, what you need versus, trying to stockpile. So there's a couple of different angles that they've looked at this idea of accumulating or storing or collecting that typically is not positive. So here we have the sage, and part of what they do, and one of the things they do is they avoid accumulation. And it's going to flesh that out a little bit. It says the more one works for others, the more one has. The more one gives to others, the more one gains. Now, I would just add one caveat here that this is not a tactic for how to end up with more in terms of accumulating, right? This isn't like, oh, if I just do this, then all of a sudden I'm going to have a whole bunch. It is, I think, looking at a different way of comprehending what more or what gain means. It's not about how do you have more toys or more stuff or more money or more protection. It has to do with more in the sense of maybe this wider connection that makes you a part of something that's more, because there's this social cohesion that has developed through people interacting with others in a certain way that connects them with each other. And that connection I think, is what gives us more of that expansive feeling in terms of I'm not in this by myself. I think frequently when we try to gather in a lot or try to find ways to protect, it's because we feel very isolated and alone and vulnerable. And so we're trying to find ways to stave off, problems or challenges because we feel very, again, vulnerable or isolated or alone. Whereas when we're very connected with our community, we might not have that same experience of life. We might feel that it is, somebody's got my back and I've got their back if they need something. And because we have this network of connections, we're in a space where we can support each other better. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm thinking of this saying I heard supposedly an African saying, the best place to store extra food is in a friend's belly.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like I heard that about Eskimos, but it's probably something that's said in a lot of different contexts. But yeah, that at that hunter-gatherer level, right? You can't just keep it because it's going to go bad. So by sharing it, you create a context in which when you're not the one that was lucky at the hunt, other people are going to share with you. Yeah.
Statement feels very Christmassy. Seems like very good timing for this.
Yeah. There you go.
I think about volunteering and the effect that it has on your like sense of community and all the benefits that you get mentally from it. Never mind like the actual benefits of volunteering and helping people out.
Hmm.
I wonder if the idea of not accumulating can be applied to this principle as well, because there's a sense in which, I mean, it's almost a people pleaser's anthem if, just do everything for everybody else and ignore your own needs.
Mm.
Uh,
Guilty.
um, and because in some sense, like by doing things for others, you come to be seen as a generous person, you gain maybe gratitude or accolades, or you bank favors. You gain the benefits of being seen as a giver, as a generous person. But maybe that's also not something that you need to accumulate. It's you like do a little bit for other people, but only so much. You don't need to just try to do everything for everybody and accumulate all of the social favor. That's also a form of accumulation.
Mm. Yeah, with a lot of the statements in the Tao Te Ching, they can sound a little bit more on the extreme side. And so we need to remember there's a bit of a hyperbole with some of these statements. But yeah, I think there's a balance in, and maybe this is getting back to that idea of being adept or where that skill comes in terms of understanding that balance, which is another key Taoist concept for sure. That balance and harmony. How do we keep these things related to each other? Yeah. Well, let's bring it then to the concluding lines and see where this ends up. It says the way or the Tao of heaven is to benefit, not to harm. So this is curious because benefit and harm are definitely categories that were in play in terms of discussing the political or philosophical discussions within the Warring States period. But they seem to have a bit of a value judgment associated with them as well, in terms of how are we evaluating it as benefit versus harm. And one of the other aspects they apply to heaven or Tian basically this idea of nature or the cosmos, is that it's impartial, and that it doesn't show favoritism. So we can see the concept of that impartiality or that lack of favoritism being connected with this idea of harming, that because it doesn't do those things, that it's not singling out one or over the other. But if we think in general, if, at least in terms of humans, if we're deciding to act in one way for the benefit of something, it can tend to have, there's obviously something else that we didn't do, right? There's a different option or a choice or something that we could have done that wasn't done because we chose to do this one thing. And so there's this idea that if you are endorsing or going in one direction, you're going the opposite of the other. So how can you ever have a situation where you could provide benefit to one thing without it simultaneously being a detriment to something else? So there's this weird kind of contrast that I think is being challenged here a bit, in that at that natural level, maybe these categories are not appropriate, or maybe the judgment is not appropriate, or maybe in some way the way that nature reacts, um, it somehow is able to do the benefit without the harm. There's a couple of different angles I think we could kind of wrestle with this. What are your thoughts on what this might be meaning, or how could this work?
You can't have life without having death. You can't benefit some things without harming other things. So you could say death and destruction are a part of nature just as much as life and creation are. But there's if death and destruction were more a part of nature than life and creation are, then nothing would exist, because the destruction principle would be greater than the creation principle. But since things do exist, there is life, and life, it is in the nature of life to expand and grow. It seems in some sense that must be the primary quality, because there's throughout history, more things have been born than have died. Otherwise, nothing would exist. More people have been born than have died. Otherwise, there would be no people. So even though there is creation and destruction, the fact that there is stuff and life does grow and expand seems to indicate that the creation principle is in some sense more primary or out in front.
Well, I think you're bringing up a number of important elements here. And one of them is also about how we are judging certain things. So it's very natural for humans to look at something like death or the end of things as negative. But as you brought up, you couldn't have one without the other. Life is utterly dependent on death in many different respects, including how we think about the concept of evolution, and how we actually got to be where we are is only because of the span of our life cycle allowing for that concept of, how evolution would engage. The longer a species lives, the less it evolves. So there's kind of like this sweet spot between the length of something and its evolution. Things that live very short durations evolve quickly. This is how things like bacteria and whatnot can become resistant to antibiotics, because they can adapt very quickly. So there's this weird connection, right? Where it's that yin yang. You can't have one without the other. They both are necessary. You can't, in a sense, embrace life without also embracing death. But how do we label that, right? And so maybe what's being brought up here with this way of nature is that this benefit is both of those things, and that harm isn't actually a valid way of looking at what nature does. That everything that happens, whether it seems like it's destructive, tsunami, earthquakes, volcanoes, whatever, is actually all part of how that benefit works. That it's not having to filter out certain types of things from other things because they're all necessary. They all become benefit. And therefore, that concept of harming isn't really possible when we're thinking about it from that nature or cosmic perspective. It's kind of a challenge to think about things that way.
From a cosmic perspective, there's no such thing as destruction. There's just rearrangement in different forms.
Yeah, and that Taoist perspective is also starting from the idea of wu, or that absence or without form. And that's that generative place of potential of which these other things, the 10,000 things, come from, right? And so there's this emerging from that into the presence, into having form, but it has that cycle that goes back. So it's almost, I don't want to say recycling, but it's just kind of this constant flow of things coming into certain arrangements and coming out of those arrangements and back again that allows for this ongoing experience to happen. Very central is the idea of change, and that it's a constant change, and that it's only through this change that all these other things are possible. Yeah, it's, I think that part of what they're trying to get at with this line is challenging, in a sense, the idea of harm um, at that cosmic level, at that nature level, which is it's a hard one for us, right? Because we definitely experience loss of things or things not going the way that we want, and we don't feel like we identify those things as harm. Um, but maybe this is a challenge to say, well, maybe we're bringing some human element to this that's confusing us or distorting our perspective because we've got this distinction that's being made. And really, it would also apply to the concept of benefit, right? Because benefit would also be kind of a category mistake, but I think it's helping to bring those concepts together or helping us see how they fit together. Then the final line is going to say that the way, or the Tao of the sages, is to practice, not contend. So this is the final line of the Daodejing. And so you would think this is going to, in some sense, really try to pull a lot of things together. The chapter as a whole, I think, as well. Somebody thought that this would be a suitable conclusion to this collection of writings. And so what I find fascinating here is throughout the text, it has really elevated this concept of wu wei, the idea of non-action, right? And we've seen action in this sense as thinking about socially derived ways of doing things. And so the wu wei is trying to find more of a spontaneous, natural way of doing things that's different from, or maybe might not be different, but it could be in conflict with more of the socially derived ways of trying to do things. But here in this final line, it says that the way of the sage is not wu wei, but simply wei, uh, which is very surprising in one sense. It seems like completely the opposite of what it's been talking about all along. But here it's bringing it together in that way. And then the final one is, so there's a way of being, of acting, that at this point isn't defined as Wu Wei, but there's probably some sense in which those are still the case. And then the final piece says that it is to not contend. And we've definitely seen this idea come up a lot, where when we see the connection with water as an example of Tao, it talks about how it doesn't fight against things. It just goes around or goes under or goes over or can gradually actually wear down like the hardest substance. That this idea of fighting against things is not the way of the sage, right? The way is not to contend. Um, what are your thoughts on these final two lines here?
It's making me think of the dude Daodejing.
The
And then
Daodejing.
the final line is probably something like, just go with the flow, dude, or something like that, you know?
Yeah, yeah. The Big Lebowski.
It brings to mind something uh something my Sifu said, you can talk or you can train, but you can't do both.
Mm.
Which has come up sometimes in certain situations, like uh if you're training martial arts with certain people, sometimes they may like I'll be training with somebody, and it's like we're training, we're developing skill, we're practicing, and then they want to start arguing about something that happened. And like arguing is not training. Like we can argue about, oh, but I could have done this or this would have really happened or whatever, and like debate and discuss. But to do that, you stop training. Like you're training and then you stop training to talk about training, so you're not training anymore. It's kind of pointless. And I've wanted to remind people of that in certain situations. Like, do you want to talk or do you want to train? Because they're not the same activity.
Hmm.
You're not getting better by talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think a lot of people when they're trying to change something, they try to kind of force it and like just do the complete opposite all the time. Like they really try to strong arm themselves into changing or into getting better at something, but really like the way to do it is to practice. And at first you should find, small ways to practice and then find ways to practice in a more high stakes situation. And then your brain will start to get used to just naturally doing things that one way. I know this is really vague, but it's a matter of finding ways to practice it instead of just saying, like, this is me now, like, period. I'm going to do all these things. And, like, there's no way that you're going to stick with it that way. Like, for example, if you're trying to start working out, I don't know, and you say, okay, now I am a person who works out. I go to the gym 7 days a week and I don't have any rest days. And like, there's no way you're going to be consistent with that. What you should do is, start walk if you're going from zero working out, right? Start walking a couple of days a week and then start like adding some weight training in maybe a little bit and then start working on your nutrition. Like you want to do it gradually and practice those things instead of going all in all at once, because that's not sustainable.
Well, it's interesting hearing you talk about that because the idea of contending almost comes into play with that, where if you try to make
Yeah.
abrupt, radical change, it's like you're, in a sense, in that context, contending with yourself. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, interesting. Well, we've got just a couple minutes left, and I had a couple of summaries here I'll just go through quickly. So there's a number of things that they have presented essentially as obstacles to this way of the sage or the way of heaven. And they maybe can be summed up in terms of that idea of contending. So, this idea of how do we do beautiful or even have the concept of beautiful is one of the things that can get in the way, creating this distinction between that beauty and ugly. There's this arguing or this distinguishing that's going on that becomes problematic. And this expansiveness, maybe in regard to, like Dane was saying, not understanding the limits of our knowledge, but it could also get into this larger perception of how we're seeing either a unity or a distinction, right? So here, that distinguishing would flow into that expansiveness in terms of seeing the world as made up of a bunch of things instead of more of a unity. And then the challenge of the acquisition or the storing up or the hoarding that was a natural tendency when we see ourselves, and maybe this is a consequence of that expansiveness, is if we see the world made up of a bunch of individual things, then we might find ourselves feeling isolated and alone and have that need for how do we store up for protection as opposed to seeing ourselves as connected. And then the flip side that we saw here was that practice or the way that would be how it's lived out. And it would begin with that idea of the honest and simple, and the idea of becoming skilled at either the language or even just this idea of how do we practice or live out what it means to recognize these patterns of Tao and incorporate them. It's the idea of Da. How does Da become manifest in the individuals? And then with the knowledge, maybe it has to do with seeing more of that unity, how the things are connected, so that it then allows us to have the capacity to be more generous rather than feeling like we need to bulwark against maybe others or life in general. Those are just some kind of my final summaries there, but I figure we'll give it a second and see if anybody had some final thoughts on this final chapter of the Tao Te Ching. And maybe I'll ask the question, have you enjoyed going through the Tao Te Ching?
Yeah, I want to do it again.
I think we will. I think we will. And again, if you're watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of our online discussions, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get a weekly email, except for this week when I forgot to send it out. I apologize. But normally you'll get a weekly email with our latest video and a link to our live Friday morning Zoom conversations. And then if you happen to be in the Southern California area, where we meet in person on Sunday mornings. All right, guys. Well, we'll see you next time.
Cool. Bye. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.